Right. So those who have read the text and attended the last lesson, you should be in a better position to understand what we're going to do today. Those who haven't and yet to read the text, please watch the previous lesson that's going to be on YouTube tomorrow. This is paper 2's text. We have 7 novels. You should have the syllabus on your tips by now. 7 novels, 5 poets, and 2 playwrights in paper 2. And the same is the situation with paper 1. Number of poems are different, obviously. 7 novels each. So who's going to tell me the name of all the 7 novels? Only volunteer if you know all the 7 novels. And don't Google it now. Ria?
Sir, Lord Jim, Sons and Lovers, Passage to India, Mrs. Dalloway, House of Mr. Biswas, Kanthapura, and Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man.
Fantastic. That is 7. Who's going to tell me the names of all 5 poets? Shuguna? Are you aware of the 5 poets in the syllabus paper 2?
Sir, I don't remember. I just remember W.H. Auden that you had asked us to read about.
Right. So for the next class, everyone must be absolutely aware of at least what all is there in the syllabus, the tips of your hand. All the 14 novels, 10 poets, 3 playwrights, 4. Right? Actually, we have 3 playwrights, right? Shakespeare's 2 plays in paper 1, and then Samuel Beckett, and no, we have 2 in paper 1 as well, Henry Gibson. So 4 playwrights, 10 poets, 14 novelists, right? You should know it at the back of your hand. And all the secondary topics. And we're doing paper 2, all the secondary topics of paper 2. So I'll test you now and then. Okay, we have done poems of Philip Larkin. Ranbir, give us all the 5 poems of Philip Larkin that we have in the syllabus. Shivam? What's happening to the boys? Anjali?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Ranbir. You try first.
Yes, sir. So we have next piece, days, deceptions, afternoons, and Mr. Beanie.
Okay. Next please, deceptions, afternoons, days, and Mr. Beanie. That is just about right. And now the next we are going to be doing W.H. Auden. Next class. I'll give a little intro to W.H. Auden in this class and what to expect. You should have read some poems by now because I told you last time. Let's recap Lord Jim and look at the concepts I discussed last time. I left you with some ideas. Some of you said that this is a really heavy text and pick a lighter one for the next time. I wish there were a lighter text in the syllabus, at least in paper 2. But so I picked who I think might be the easier of the poets in our syllabus. And if you've read the poetry of A.K. Ramanujan and you feel that those poems are easy, then you are mistaken. Those poems are probably as difficult as any that we have in the syllabus. By difficult, I don't mean difficult as in difficult. Difficult is a wrong word. It's misleading for you because Nothing is difficult in the syllabus. It's just Ramanujan's poetry has a lot more layers, and you are expected to understand them better because you are Indians and he was an Indian and he was writing from an Indian vantage point. But they're far from straightforward literal poems. Anyway, Lord Jim. So what we discussed last time was Lord Jim was written by Joseph Conrad at the turn of the century. This is the first modernist text. As if we look at the chronology of texts that we have in the syllabus, we have, if we look at the novels, you're not supposed to remember the date of publishing, the date of birth and the death of poets and authors. All these dates are not required in UPSC answer writing, as opposed to they are required when you're writing university answers. So anyone who's written university or college answers, you must have put all this information there, because the whole idea of a university answer sheet is to fill as many pages as you can. So you fill whatever you can remember. We don't need to remember all these factual stuff. What we need to remember is, let's start with the very first modernist text. So paper 2 syllabus starts at the turn of the century, that is 1901. And the latest would be A.K. Ramanujan, somewhere in 1980s, 90s. So let's chronologically arrange these before we move further, and let's see how many of you remember. As I said, you don't need to remember exact time, exact year of publishing. Even I don't remember it because I never wanted to. But some idea of when they were published, because it is crucial to understand the socio-political background of when that novel or the poem was written. That's why we remember when a work came out. So let's chronologically arrange the novels first. So this is the first one. This came out sometimes in 1901, 1903. I don't know whether it's not. Sometimes in 1901, 1903. Then which would be the next novel in our syllabus in terms of the chronology? Anyone? Give it a guess.
D.H. Lawrence.
D.H. Lawrence. Okay. Anyone else? So when do you think D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers came out? A rough idea. What decade? 1920s, 30s, 40s?
1930s.
Okay, that's right. That's just about right. So we have Passage to India, which came out when? I told you
1923.
1923, right? And I asked you to read around the events happening in India at that time. And we did talk about that it came out in 1923 and the author was in India in 1920 and 21. And he did not mention Jallianwala Bagh. We discussed that, right? So 1920s, Passage to India. So that would be the second one. Then James Joyce and Virginia Woolf were also writing around the same time, 30s, right? So next time, remember the chronology. So the first task is everyone should know all the texts, all the poems. I'll keep testing you in every class. The second task is arrange them chronologically. First the novels, then the poets. And when we'll do the poets, we'll also mark the chronology of the poems. Not because we'll be writing about that in the exam. We will never be writing that this poem was published in this year. That is a waste of one line. But we need to understand the context. So to give you an example so that you understand this idea, how many of you have read T.S. Eliot's The Journey of Magi? The Three Magas, Journey of Maggie, how many of you have read? None of you. Have you heard of it?
No,
None
sir.
of you have heard, not even heard the poem. T.S. Eliot has only 3 poems in the syllabus: The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock, Burnt Norton, and The Journey of Muggy. The Journey of Muggy was written in 1927. Now, why is that year important? Obviously, we won't be writing 1927 and all that unless there is a context, and there is a very important context to 1927. That was the year T.S. Eliot accepted Christianity. T.S. Eliot accepted Anglican Catholicism, or to quote the press release of the time, that he was accepted into the Anglican Catholicism in the year 1927. So that was a time when he adopted a new faith. Prior to that, he was an agnostic and an atheist. Agnostic and atheist, as in not atheist in the leftist sense, but he did not believe in any religious system of faith. He did not discard them, so he did not criticize them, or he did not talk badly about them, because in 1915 he wrote a poem called The Wasteland, which did borrow a lot of elements from Indian philosophy and Hinduism and other cultural legacies around the world. But until 1927, he did not belong to any religious organization, organized religion. In 1927, he adopted a new faith, and the poem Journey of Muggy talks about that. So if you read the Journey of Muggy simply literally on the basis of what the poem is saying, and you don't know the background of that poem or the context of the year it was published, you'll miss half the story. Right? Does that make sense? Is it making sense why I'm asking you to put these states? Not to write in the exam, but to build a context.
Yes,
For
sir.
example, W.H. Auden wrote a poem called The Partition. That was about the partition of India and Pakistan. And that happened in 1948. Right? But the poem came out in 1961. The poem must have been written around the time of the partition, but it was published in 1960s. That in itself says something about the poem. That is a finer point that we need to understand. Right? Does that make sense? Everyone understands
Yes, sir.
why I ask you
Yes,
to
sir.
read, around the poem and the poet, why I wanted to understand more about the poet's life, ideology, thought process, and all that, because we are almost working backwards. We're doing a reverse engineering. We're looking at a piece of text, and then we are going backwards. And then by trying to understand poet's life, poet's ideas, and trying to understand the society of that time, the politics, the history, the culture of that time, we then come back to the poem and then we piece it together. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
There is a specific school of literary theory, theoretical thought, based on which I do this exercise. And as we'll read more texts, because we have 4 literary theoretical ideas in our syllabus: feminism, Marxism, post-colonialism, and psychoanalysis. So we'll be looking at each text from these 4 ideas. We'll be applying these 4 ideas. We'll be looking at the same text from these 4 different perspectives. A literary theoretical school, or a school of any literary theory, is a specific way of looking at the text, and a text could be a film, text could be an essay, text could be a book, text could be a piece of art. So when you look at Passage to India from a feminist point of view, you're looking at it from a specific perspective. When you're looking at a Passage to India from a Marxist point of view, it's a completely different perspective. And if you apply psychoanalytical theories at it, it's a completely different. So we have 4 different viewpoints. Of course, post-colonialism will not apply to each text, but some of the texts that where post-colonialism is valid and relevant, we'll use that. Does that make sense? That's how you'll understand about these ideas. Because when you must have seen these topics in your syllabus, Marxism, feminism, you must be wondering how to prepare these topics. Because if you start reading about feminism, there is so much, there is no end. There are so many great thinkers who have written about feminism. But all these secondary topics we need to understand in context to the texts in the syllabus only. Right? So this is our framework. They'll never ask you to write a short note on feminism, for example. Not anymore. They have done it in the past, but not anymore. They'll always ask you to apply feminism on a certain text. Or they'll ask you, like for Passage to India, there is a very relevant question. Is Adela Quested a feminist? Right? And none of you did that question. So I want you to write that question for the next class, and you're also supposed to send me questions for this class, which you haven't. So Philip Larkin questions in the next class, and do this specific question: is Adela Quested a feminist? So I want to see how you tackle it before we talk about feminism and Marxism. Joseph Conrad, born in Poland, spent his time on the British Raj, British Empire, or European empires, ships, and became part of the maritime industry. Spent a lot of time there. He could write fluently in Polish, French, and English, and he wrote in all three languages. His most important novel is Heart of Darkness, which I suggest you all go watch because it's a fantastic movie also, starring Marlon Brando. And Lord Jim is very similar to Heart of Darkness in theme. The theme of Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim are very similar. And we talked about the theme, and we'll talk about the theme a bit more. We were talking about why Lord Jim is one of the first modernist texts in the syllabus, and not just in the syllabus, but in the literature, in the literary world. It came out at the turn of the century. That's where officially Victorian era ended, because Queen Victoria died in 1901. So that's where we say that officially the Victorian age ended in 1901, and the next age, which was modernist, started. There are no other logical reasons to define the ages like this, right? If any one of you can tell me when the Romantic age ended officially. Can anyone tell me?
No idea.
No idea. Can anyone tell me when William Wordsworth died? That's sometimes in 1848, or 47 or 49, sometimes there. And again, so why do we need to remember the death of these people? Because it's contextual and relevant. 1848 is when William Wordsworth died, and that's when the age of Romanticism finished formally. And then the next age, which was the Victorian age, started. Right? So we have three things. We have texts arranged as per the ages, literary ages. Yeah. And then we have literary theories. So when we start our paper 1 syllabus, we start with the Elizabethan and Jacobean age. That's where William Shakespeare and John Donne are writing. I'm going through the syllabus and trying to go through the entire syllabus for you. Vis-a-vis the ages, literary ages. So Elizabethan and Jacobean, William Shakespeare and John Donne. Then, which is the next age in our syllabus? Anyone who's seen the paper 1 syllabus?
So Milton.
John Milton, Alexander Pope. So, of course, there is an age of Puritan age, there is an age of Milton, but we don't have those in our syllabus. We have neoclassicism, right? So we club them in neoclassical age. Then we move forward to Swift, Jonathan Swift, which is in literature syllabus is the age of satire. We don't have that. We move right away to the Romanticism. So in Romanticism, we have William Wordsworth. Then we have the age of William Wordsworth, age of Romanticism ends in 1848, and the Victorian starts, Victorian era. A Victorian era is very dominant in paper 1 because we have 4 novels from the Victorian age. And of course, Alfred Tennyson, 1 big poem and 4 novels from Victorian age. And there are going to be at least 40 marks worth of question from Victorian age. And there are, most of the time, there is definitely 1 short note in paper 1 on Victorian age or the topics relevant to Victorian age. So Victorian age ends 1901, paper 1 ends. Paper 2 starts modernism, which we have this modernism, post-colonial ideas, and then the postmodernism. So we need to remember roughly the dates, not because we'll be writing about them in the exam, but to understand the socio-political background. So 1848, 1901, that was the reign of Queen Victoria. We need to understand, almost like a historian, what was happening in Europe and England at that time, because all that understanding would be very useful when you read those texts. Because why? Literature is the mirror to its society. So you're reading a piece of literature, and then you understand about that society separately, and then you piece them together. Right? Does it make sense?
Yes.
So this approach is called, technically, we should be reading the text and then trying to understand from the reading of the text, we try to understand how the society was at that time as portrayed in the text. That's what we should be doing technically. But I'm giving you a cheat code to make it easier for you, because I understand these texts are alien to us in terms of the culture, the history, the society, everything is European or American. So we're taking a little hack and reading about the society, reading about the poet's life or the author's life, reading about what was happening in the world where the book was written or the text was written. So then it makes sense. Right? We did this exercise when we were doing a passage to India. Right? We tried to understand William Foster's life and why he did not why he did not mention much about the freedom struggle of India, even though at that time when the book came out and when he wrote the book, freedom struggle of India was at its peak. There were so many things happening, so many great national heroes, but he chose to ignore them. We talked about that, right? And it's difficult to answer that question simply after reading the text. So you have to take into account the socio-political historical context to understand certain things. Does that make sense? Like in your GS syllabus, there is a historian who writes about ancient India. I think Guha. No, not Guha. Who's the most famous ancient history text for GS? He was a Delhi University or JNU scholar.
R.S. Sharma.
Not R.S. Sharma. No. He was a leftist. Very famous, like people swear by him. Well, so he ancient India history. He wrote about. He wrote like this that people in the real ancient India, even at the timeline when uh, Ram was alive, Lord Ram, and the mythology might have took place. He says beef eating was a norm. Beef eating was not something that was looked down upon because the cultural context of that time required people to domesticate and eat beef. And then when you read that sentence or read those ideas now, it sounds like almost blasphemy that someone's saying that people of India in the Ram Raj, they were eating beef. So that's why you need to really understand the context of when or with what ideas somebody is writing something, right? Because you are going to be UPSC officer and you need to understand the bigger picture. You can't just rely on the literal what's given to you. You need to go beyond it and understand why what 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 forced E.M. Forster to write in a cryptic language about the British Raj. What forced him to not include a lot of things, right? Okay, back to Lord Jim. So it's an early modernist text. And I told you last time that we'll gradually understand what modernism is. So one of the first things that that differentiate a modernist text from a Victorian text is the narrative style, right? And narrative style we discussed in a modernist text, an omniscient narrator is not trusted. That heroic narration of the Victorian style is not done because in the modern times, heroes no longer exist. The modernist narrative style, they understand that the narrative is an unreliable narrative, which I might have written somewhere. Uh, Modern times, the modern era, in terms of modern as in the literary and the cultural modern era, was spec by disillusionment, distrust in the system, and the shattering of all existing beliefs. And we talked about why that happened. And if you look historically at the time period between end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, the wars, the power structure, the dynamics of power, the scientific religious tussle, that all was happening. So the fundamentals of religious faith, scientific temperament, social structure, that was all being revised and shattered, right? We talked about Charles Darwin's Origin of Species that challenged the religious belief that man was created by God in 7 days. Charles Darwin said, no, he was not. It's a millions of years of an evolutionary exercise. The power structure of the church was challenged by the Queen of England as she set up Church of England in England. So instead of the Catholic power in Vatican, centered in Vatican, now it was now very much in England, United Kingdom. Scientific discoveries and experiments were shattering previous beliefs about everything. Albert Einstein basically challenged the mechanics, the physics of mechanics, Newton's mechanics, and so many other things. And power structure, social structure, so many wars were happening. England and British Empire was going down, nosing down. They lost wars in South Africa, in America, and the British Raj's biggest colony, India, was making a lot of noise. And then the world wars happened, First World War and the Second World War. So it was a very, very difficult time for the people there. It was said that an entire generation of young men in the 1920s and 30s was wiped off in England and Europe because they were sent to war as soon as they turned 18 and they were dead. By an estimate, around 80% of the people who went to war never returned. And those who returned back, most of them returned back with a thing called PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which we'll read about in Mrs. Dalloway. So it was a horrendous time for people in Europe. And so that's why the artists, the painters, the musicians, the writers, they also needed some different tools to be able to make sense of this world, right? So the first tool, when you're writing a novel, when you're writing a story, the first thing is how the story is going to be told. That's the narrative device. Is it going to be told in the first person or the second person or the third person? Is there going to be a narrator like in the Victorian times? That was the norm, that there would be an omniscient narrator who basically hand-holded the reader and told them everything. Now the modernists were like, they would not rely upon a narrator. They did not consider the Victorian style of writing apt to express modern feelings. They needed a lot more symbols, images, metaphors, figures of speech to make sense of what's happening. Basic, simple, plain, literal language would not work. So we see all that in the modern text. We already saw the narrative style in Lord Jim, how after the first 3 chapters, it changes. And we have an unreliable narrator in Lord Jim, who is Marlowe. So the story is told through Marlowe. And the Marlowe character is interesting because can you really trust him as a reader? Because his information, the information that he's passing to us, is based on hearsay and what people told him, information collected and gathered through 20, 30, 40 years, right? So it's gossip at best. So it's a very classic sign of an unreliable narrator as in the modern setting. So modernist writers are telling us that you cannot rely on a narrator because you have to ask where this information is coming from. What's the source of this information? And we have that narrator here. So it's like anyone who's seen Life of Pi, where towards the end, Irfan Khan gives 2 versions of the story, and the journalist asks him, so which one is true? Right? Have you all seen The Life of Pi?
Yes.
Last May, the journalist asked him, was there really a tiger? And then Irfan gives him a second version very quickly. And then Irfan asks him, which version do you prefer? The one with the tiger or one without it? And he said, yes, one with the tiger. And Irfan just laughs and that's it. So that is an unreliable narrative. That is a technical problem that modernists understood. So, narrative technique we've done. Okay, the theme of the text we talked last time was a British lad, Jim's aspirations to become a colonial lord. So, is that it? Does that cover the entire theme of the text? Because he sets out with his aspirations, yes, and he got a chance to captain a ship very early 20s, yes, he was happy but then he failed and he spent a lot of years in obscurity. But then he got a chance and an opportunity to serve his colonial aspirations, and he grabs that opportunity and he dies as a hero. So basically, he's redeemed even in his death, and he dies as a colonial lord, as a colonial hero. So last pages of the text when we read the last time, that this was successful for him. This was a success. This was a huge success for him, his death as a hero, trying to be a savior. So this question can be asked in affirmative. Yes, Lord Jim is primarily about young British lad Jim's aspirations to become a colonial lord, because that's how the story ends. It starts with his aspirations and it ends with his death as a hero. Now, as we talked about once, that what is the primary action of this text? The primary action of this text is the drowning of the ship Patna, where Jim was assigned as a chief mate. And the ship drowns, almost drowns, was salvaged, people don't die, but Jim jumps off to save his life. And then the court case charges him guilty. He is asked to stay away from the ships. He spends a lot of years as a water clerk, a desk job in the shipping industry. And then all those years do not kill his colonial aspirations. That's the interesting part, right? Because as soon as he got an opportunity, he jumped at it, grabbed it, and he went all the way. So that one situation put a dent on his colonial aspirations. Basically, it was a reality check, but it did not dissuade him enough. So when they say, the question says, what is that situation? It's a Patna affair. How is it important? Why is Patna affair important? One, when we read that chapter 2 and chapter 3, it clearly demonstrates the post-colonial, the colonial narrative, the Orientalism in play. We understand it. We understand right away where Jim is coming from. We understand right away his aspirations, his imaginative, heroic aspirations. We understand all that. And when he fails, what does that demonstrate? What do we get in terms of when he fails in his own aspirations and fails the shipping company, fails the pilgrims? How is that important in paving his rest of his life? Anyone? Ria, Anjali?
Sir, he feels
Jim,
ashamed.
Yeah, one by one. Yeah, Ria.
Sir, he falls in his own eyes, and then he keeps on moving from port to port whenever people recognize him. So he's still, I think he's looking for an opportunity then to redeem himself.
Okay, Anjali.
sir, as Ria said, Jim always see that incident as a missed opportunity, missed chance. So it's not like he never confront his cowardice. He always tries to justify that he thought the partnership was going to drown. That's why he jumped from it, and he was always looking for a chance to prove his heroism next. That's what I think.
Interesting. When he jumped off and he was proven a coward and a failure publicly, and even in his own eyes, we don't know whether in his own eyes he accepted that he was a coward, and that's why he took desk jobs. He could have always returned back to England. or he could have done anything else, right? He could have hid, but he chose to stay around the same ecosystem, right? In obscurity, obviously. So one thing is sure, that even though it was a reality check, his imaginative aspirations of heroics did not die. So those imaginations, just what we talked about, how do you persuade 18-year-old kids to go and fight a battle which you know nothing about? Basically, it's a ticket to death. It's a sure way to die, because 80% of these kids are not returning back. How do you persuade those people to come forward and join with excitement? How do you do that? That is the colonial narrative. You make it sound so appealing, patriotic, nationalistic, heroic, to do your bit for your country, for your motherland, for your nation, that everything else is secondary to them. They'll disregard, they'll ignore that they're going to kill people, or they're going to rule over someone else's territory, or what the repercussion is going to be. For them, it is a chance to be a hero. So that imaginative, that the phrase used by Conrad in the end, exalted egoism, exalted egoism. Their egos were so exalted that they were made to think they are heroes. And a little setback like Patna or whatever did not dissuade him. Otherwise, somebody like him who went through the court case, who was shamed publicly, right? He would have just given up. But he did not. He waited for years and years and years. That means those imaginative ideas, those ideas of heroics, that colonial narrative that was hardwired into his brain, was stronger than anything else, and it did not stop until he died for it. It's almost a story of terrorists brainwashed to do ugly things in the world. It's almost like that story. Recruiting very young kids from villages, and those kids, like this guy who came from Pakistan to India, 18-year-old guy, Kasab, he was on a heroic mission. Everything else was secondary. So it is almost like that story. Okay, there was this guy who died, the captain that he met, Captain Brierly, and he committed suicide. Why? Why did he commit suicide? Hmm?
So this part was not clear. I could not get it in the novel itself.
Okay, anyone else?
Sir, I think he asked his mate, he gave instructions to his mate on how to navigate and all, and then he took something heavy and put it in his pocket and then jumped from the ship. That's what I understood.
Okay.
Sir, I think if we can make this to the last question, he was also an officer, and he almost achieved everything that the narrative was told to him, and he achieved all these medals and even titles from the foreign lands. So he was almost like a colonial lord already. But then he suicides, and the reason is not clear. Maybe it is because he understands after all that the reality of the whole narrative.
Yeah, that's it is actually not clear why he committed suicide. It's not. It's kept in a very ambiguous terms. But that is another good reminder to Jim that this is how seriously the soldiers of this British Empire or European Empire take their duties and responsibilities, in which he failed, and he still does not feel guilty. Right? Do you remember how he thinks about Bradley's suicide and he does not feel it? He cannot connect to it. So Bradley obviously committed suicide because he failed in his duties. Just once, and even nobody knows when. His record was perfect. He was the most sought after captain. But he knew somewhere, if you read that scene, he had committed something, some blunder, which he was not able to live with. Right? And here is Jim, who has committed a blunder which is publicly shamed, and he's absolutely fine with it. He's not only living with it, but he's fine. That again tells you how strong those imaginative, heroic ideas were. Okay. So I think we have with a lot of ideas. We discuss a bit about, I'll give you some opener to W.H. Auden's poetry, so that when you read them, you keep these ideas in mind. W.H. Auden. There is a small secondary topic called the poet of the 30s. Poet of the 30s were writing obviously in the decade of 30s, and and they were writing about, they were slightly left leaning, and you'll see in certain poems of W.H. Auden as well that he had that left inclination, but not very strong. They all predicted the Second World War. Just a second, let me grab some more. Right. Yeah. And we have Shield of Achilles, Partition, Musée de Beaux Arts, three major poems. Shield of Achilles gets a lot of questions. Partition should be very important for 2023 and 2024. It has become relevant. Musée de Beaux Arts is a different, technically very different style of poem. And so what Auden writes about, then there is September 1, 1939, which is the first day of the Second World War, where he goes through the events that led to Second World War. In the Shield of Achilles, he paints a picture. He uses a technique called juxtaposition, where he juxtaposes the ancient classical a reference to the time of Achilles, the Greek heroes, and juxtaposes that time with the modern time. In Musée, a poem, it's a French title translated to Museum of the Fine Arts. In that poem, he's looking at, he's the narrator, the speaker is inside the museum and he's looking at certain paintings, famous paintings. One of them is about the birth of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, and the what's that character, falling of that character, what's his name?
Icarus.
Icarus and his father, yes, very good. So fall of Icarus. So he's looking at these three paintings and he's deducing certain ideas about a disinterestedness of humanity. Auden believed in two ideas, eros and agape. So he believed that most people are within a selfish love for themselves and their near dear ones. And what the world needs is a universal love, where we stop being selfish for just my family, my neighborhood, my country, and look at the wider humanitarian side of things. That's what his ideas of eros and agape is his own ideology rides upon, and he keeps coming back to it in all the poems, most of the poems. Auden uses a lot of classical myths and references outside of the poems as opposed to what Philip Larkin did. So now when we'll do W.H. Auden, we'll understand what myth kitty is and why myths are used, why external allusions are used by the modernist poets. A.S. Eliot would do these even more. W.B. Yeats was originally called a myth maker. He not only used classical myths, Greek myths, but also created his own system of myths. So he was called a myth maker. Auden uses these myths. For example, the Musée de Beaux-Arts poem, he's looking at classical paintings and then he's referring to either the biblical ideas or the mythological ideas. In the Shield of Achilles, obviously, the character of Achilles, who some of you might be aware of, was in some mythologies the son of Zeus or the son of Apollo or son of Mars, the warlord, and whose unbeatable could not be killed, except one weakness, if he was shot in his heels. That's why the term Achilles is heel. So it's built around a hero who could not be defeated, but even he was killed. Right? So Auden used a lot of myths. When you read W.H. Auden, you're gonna have to look at those myths. So when you're reading, for example, the Shield of Achilles, I can let you go and check the mythology of Achilles, for example, rather than go and check the summary of the poem or critical essays on the poem. Decode these allusions, right? In the Musée de Beaux-Arts poem, there is a reference to Icarus. So read about Icarus. There is reference to these three paintings. Read about these paintings. And then come to the poem and then try to make sense. Right? That would be fine. In September 1, 1939, he does talk about the birthplace of Hitler, psycho, what does he call it? Psychopathic god, something like that. So you have to understand what happened on September 1, 1939. What are the events he's talking about? What are the ideas he's referring to? What are the external illusions? So you can take help of the internet to decode those external illusions, decode those mythical or biblical references, and then come back to the poem and try to understand what he's saying, right? And then we'll talk about that. And I need some answers of Philip Larkin from all of you. And we'll do this class on day after tomorrow, Tuesday, Wednesday evening. So, Shlokam and Shuguna, Lord Jim, Passage to India, and Philip Larkin. These are the three texts that we've already done. So one way is you can go back, but then you won't be able to catch up with what's happening now. So I would suggest that you leave these texts for now and come back to them at the end of the course. And if you can, then obviously read and catch up. But try to catch up, try to stay with the schedule now. So we're doing WH now, and we'll be doing after WH Jordan, we'll be doing, let's not do Mrs. Dalloway. Now let's do Kantapura. So give you a bit of a relief. You might feel a bit better with Kantapura. So we'll do Kantapura after that. So you can also start reading Kantapura and W. Jordan's poems at the same time, because the poems won't take a lot of your time. Okay. And Shlokam and Shoguna, you can go watch even on my YouTube channel or in the playlist of this course on YouTube. The very first lesson where I'm talking about how to read poetry, and I have done a lot of videos on that, how to read poetry, how to read original text. Give a quick look at that to understand how do I suggest you read poetry, how do I suggest you read original texts. Even on my channel, if you go to the back right in the beginning, you'll search, you'll find how to read text, how to read poetry. So give it a quick look. Okay. So I can see
Okay,
some of you heaving a sigh of relief that Lord Jim is gone, and we are on to some interesting poetry about him. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Well, guys, you have no idea what's coming next. Let's see, by then you'll get used to it. Actually, this does come across as a more difficult text, because by the time you get to T.S. Eliot and James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, you are acclimatized to modernism, and which is not a bad thing. And this is difficult reading because he writes in Victorian style, old English, and a lot of typical terminology of the sea, and a lot of technical details. And he's a beautiful writer. I love his prose. I absolutely love the way he writes. But he does what I ask you not to do as a writer. He makes very long sentences. Right? So as a creative writer, he can do that because he can also handle that. And you must have noticed it. Then long sentences, multiple phrases, so many figures of speech and symbols. Right? So I love his writing. There are very few writers who can write and pull off like this. But jokes. Having said that, Joseph Conrad is a difficult writer. Everything else is going to be easy. On that note, have a good rest of the evening. See you day after. W. Jordan. Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So